Aaron, your work, it spans AI, philosophy of mind, biology, physics, all centered on one powerful idea, and that is information. Not just matter and energy, but rather that information lies at the heart of what makes something alive. So I thought we could start off this podcast by exploring the central thesis by first defining life through information. Could you explain how your conception of information, not in the in the Shannon sense, but in the way you describe it, departs from traditional functionalist or computationalist slash physicalist models?
Yes, well, it's perhaps worth saying that the Shannon model, Claude Shannon, who worked for Bell Telephone Company, was based on a technology for storing, transmitting, and transforming information in digital circuits. And therefore, it's all based on bits. And many people have thought that all information has to be based on bits because of what Shannon did, but they don't realize that that was just because of the technology he was using and the purposes for which he was using. The purposes for which biological organisms use information are very different, including controlling growth and movement and all kinds of things that we will talk about. And one particular example we'll talk about is the metamorphosis of an insect, which decomposes part of the insect and then creates new structures and new abilities and so on. Amazing stuff. We'll come back to that later. But there's nothing like that in the Shannon system. And so one should not expect Shannon information to be terribly relevant. Many people do not understand that. Shannon, I think, was not confused, but many of his admirers, I think, have been confused by the success of what he did into thinking it was much more general and much more widely applicable than it actually is. And that's a serious mistake that I think many people have made.
In your work, you sort of argue that the defining feature of life isn't just metabolism or reproduction, but the use of information. What do you mean by that?
Well, in I suppose the information is always about something. So you can't just have information without something having some context, content, something that is referred to, something else about which the information is. And that can vary in enormously wide range of ways in organisms. Um, and I think the earliest organisms were ones that had only one cell. They were uh, able to somehow interact with the immediate environment using chemical and other interactions. And gradually, as living forms became more complicated, the number of cells increased and the numbers of forms of information transfer increased and so on. But all along, there was the fact that there was something that had to acquire information and something that was using the information, sorry, something from which the information was acquired. And I believe that this is not widely understood. And as a result, people jump to the wrong conclusions about how animals work. So we could perhaps go back to thinking about what the earliest organisms might have been. Perhaps just single cells doing what? What would a single cell want to do in a world? Well, one thing might be to just exist. And for that, it might not have to do anything at all, or it might need to um, exist and use up energy in some way, or exist and grow or move or something. And for each of these extra functions, it would need extra competences. And somehow, over time, biological evolution provided ways in which these simple single celled organisms could be extended into more complex structures, partly by combining with other single cells in increasingly complex ways.
Sorry, continue.
Well, I was just going to say, and that process continued not only for a very long time, but in very different ways, different parts of the planet. Who knows what happened on other planets, if it did. And there's eventually a huge variety of consequences of this, or follow-ups to this very early kind of life form. But I think one of the things that is generally misunderstood is the belief that somehow the synapses in brains of animals are helping the neurons to do the real work of taking information and deciding what to do and so on. And the synapses enable the neurons to connect with one another because the way they join up with the synapses. And I'm saying it's the other way around, that the synapses are doing all the important reasoning, decision making, and so on. And the neurons enable them to communicate with other parts of the body and get information and transfer information. And so the belief that most people have is back to front, you could say. And I have not yet found anyone else who's exactly formulated that idea, although various people have come close. At the moment, I can't remember them, but I might come back later.
When you say that let's take it front to back. If you think about the information being carried along these synapses, how should someone who let's say is not a biologist, how should they sort of imagine this type of information being carried? Where is it? What is it? What type of space is this existing in? And how is it being transmitted?
Well, the synapse is a cell which has molecules. And when you have lots of molecules, they can form different structures, different forms of combinations of structures which are forming or changing. And they can, in that sense, differ quite a lot, even though they're all a single cell with a lot of molecules. So what goes on in those cells may vary from one cell to another, even though they may be close together in the same organism. So I'm now saying that somehow the formation of these collections of molecules and the ways in which they behave and interact encodes information about all sorts of different things, including information about the animal's history, also information about the current environment, which is coming in through various channels, information about goals and so on. And those forms of information that need to be combined in various ways, I'm suggesting all make use of chemical processes, biochemical processes, deep down in synapses, and that people who think it's all done by neural networks are just getting it badly wrong.
Well, okay, let's break this up into living systems and then non-living systems, because you contrast things like non-living systems like tornadoes or rivers to that of things like life. And why, in your view, have our scientific models been so inadequate when it comes to capturing informational dimensions of life? And I think while we're at it, how would you define life?
How would I define life? Well, I don't think there's any simple definition. It's what we have many examples of, with a huge variety of forms in which the various instances of this life are acquiring information and using it both to transform themselves in various ways by growing structures in themselves and whatever, and also by linking up with other such organisms, but also they transform the environment to meet their needs. Now, a tornado can transform the environment, but it doesn't look at the environment and find out what's there and work out how it needs to be changed in order to enable a tornado to achieve something that it's trying to achieve. Tornadoes cannot represent possible futures for themselves and use that in order to make choices. They are very complex interactions of processes going on, but not with that kind of use of information that we find in life.
Mm.
And the same thing about volcanic structures and continental drift, where you have very large structures in the earth moving around in various ways. They don't have any goals. They're not trying to achieve anything. They're just doing what happens because of the physical forces and the configurations they're in. Whereas organisms have goals, they have needs, they have preferences, and they're acquiring and using information in order to achieve goals, preferences, and also just to stay alive.
Do you think that we perhaps need a philosophical reorientation? So almost like, do you see the emphasis on biological, meaningful information as a flawed ontology? So what I'm trying to ask is do you think that we should consider information as more fundamental, where it's fundamental throughout space, time, matter? This is what we should be looking at when we're talking about anything.
Well, I'm not quite sure what the weight of the word fundamental is, but it's certainly all pervasive in life. You could not have life without information. But the information is of many different kinds. It serves many different purposes. It's used in different mechanisms. And the various ways of combining information are different for different parts of the same organism and within different organisms, and also between organisms and non-organisms. Organisms can manipulate matter that does not use information or want to do anything, but the organisms can use the matter to do something that the organism wants, and it manipulates matter for that purpose.
Well, one of the questions I had for you was the challenges your work has on physics. For example, when you make the claim that, or well, when you discuss the evidence behind insect metamorphosis, where organisms disassemble and then reassemble itself with minimal energy in spaces, how does this pose a challenge for physics? And how does it sort of portray all the gaps within physics?
Well, I don't know about all the gaps, but some gaps.
Oh,
So what happens during metamorphosis is that an organism that has a lot of structures that have been developed, possibly in an animal that has been crawling around and feeding on matter that's around it, eating stuff, digesting it, building structures, and so on. And then after a while, something triggers a process that begins a very complex change of structures. So this organism that had all sorts of parts starts dissolving some of those parts and reusing some of the molecules to build new parts that were not there before. For instance, in the case of an animal that previously was crawling, it might build wings, which it did not have previously, and it might build new feeding structures. For example, animals that start off crawling and essentially chewing food in their immediate environment may develop an ability to fly to a flower where it feeds by putting a long proboscis down into the nectar. And in the process, it also helps the flowers. It doesn't know it's helping the flowers, but it picks up pollen and so on. And when it goes to the next plant, it can transfer some of that pollen. And in that process way, it's helping helping the plant to reproduce and share genes and so on. It doesn't know it's doing it. The insect doesn't have any goals of that sort, but it happens to have evolved in such a way that it achieves that. So there's a lot of cooperative co-evolution going on in this mindless world, almost as if there were intelligence controlling it. I'm not saying there is any intelligence controlling it. I'm saying there are amazing mechanisms that act as if there are intelligence controlling it. And those are things that we don't yet understand. And it may well be that the forms of control cannot yet be accounted for by current theories in fundamental physics. For instance, the forms of control needed to decompose the parts of a cocoon, of an organism in the cocoon. What is there in physics that says you can tell bits of this structure to start decomposing themselves and to move around to form new structures? And I suspect that there isn't anything at present that gives a complete explanation of that. And I have a colleague whom I may have mentioned to you in email messages, who is a scientist with whom I became friendly when we were students originally, who has had similar ideas, but he also does not know what those mechanisms might be. Anthony Leggett, we met as students. At that point, he was more a philosopher and doing history of philosophy and so on. But he later switched to physics, and he eventually ended up with a Nobel Prize for his work in physics. But we kept in touch, and every now and again we would meet up and talk about these things, and to some extent agree, and sometimes perhaps disagree, or at least we might feel that there are things that can't be explained and agree they can't be explained, but not have similar ideas about how to move towards explanations. And I don't think he had ever thought about metamorphosis until I started challenging him to provide explanations for things, which I don't think he or anyone else at the moment can do.
It's incredible how the people you meet as a student can fundamentally shape the way you are. And it reminds me of the story you once told about when you were a student. This was before you went into philosophy, and how much you used to go into the religious lectures and just sort of try and counter argue until one day one of your philosophy friends told you to read a book by Russell, and you were like, okay, this is a pretty fascinating journey. What is that like to finally read a philosophy book that really takes you and grips you, not necessarily changing your view into some sort of a religious dogma, but showing you that actually philosophical arguments play a very huge role within science?
Well, I think he lent me the Bertrand Russell's History of Science,
Mm.
History of Science, yes. And when I read it at first, I thought Russell must be the greatest scientist who had ever lived. But gradually, I started finding things that didn't quite satisfy me, and I started wondering what else there might be, and learning about other things that Russell didn't mention. And one of the things came through Immanuel Kant and David Hume. I'm
Mm.
not sure I can remember the precise details, but David Hume was examining what theologians and other people had claimed and had written, and he came up with a kind of slogan that your theories should either be things that can be based on observation, where you go around and see what is there in the world or whatever, or alternatively, you can collect lots of observations and then combine them using forms of logic and using logical induction and so on. And he had a slogan. Unfortunately, I can't now remember exactly what it was, but uh, he did that to challenge these people. And Immanuel Kant came across what Hume had done And he said this woke him from his dogmatic slumbers because he realized that not all the forms of knowledge that we have and that he, Kant, was interested in could be handled by the mechanisms that David Hume said were okay. In particular, Kant thought of forms of reasoning that could not be based on collecting statistical data and then finding patterns in the statistics. Examples were, for instance, discovering that if you have a glove that fits onto a right hand, you cannot make it fit onto a left hand, go from a right hand to a left hand, without first turning it inside out. And then it will work. And what kind of thing is that impossibility? And he said he thought that this was very hard to explain, and I think he used a phrase like concealed in the depths of the human soul. We would never be able to understand what's going on there. And what I've been trying to do is to kind of bring it out from the depths, but inspired by Kant and using many of his examples and transforming them, but trying to combine those ideas with ideas that I'm getting from other people, including physicists and some of my own hunches and so on.
Mm. You've been at it for so many years, and your work has been incredible. You've done so much within these fields of biology, physics, philosophy of mind, AI. How your work at the moment, when you go onto your website and you see that you've been posting actively as a work in progress in your later years now, and now going through what you're going through currently, how's the journey been when you see that the incredible amount, the body of knowledge you have, and how your ideas are changing and shaping as you currently produce content right now?
Well, one of the problems is that as my brain slides downhill, it gets harder. And I have to make more use of computational aids of various sorts. And that is a problem. But another factor is that I've come to the feeling that there's something deep going on that we haven't understood and that nobody so far has understood. And I'm not claiming that I've understood, but I'm groping towards something that perhaps someone cleverer, younger, with ideas that I haven't had, will be able to come up with some new answers to some of these questions. But these are questions about the processes we've been talking about and how they are controlled and what it is in the physical world, what is it in the nature of fundamental physics that makes it possible for them to work. And I leave open the possibility that there have to be changes in fundamental physics that I can't anticipate. I can't myself claim to be a physicist, and I can't say here's a bit of physics that we may need to change. But perhaps someone looking at this work who has a deeper knowledge of physics will be able to look at it and say, yes, this is now what we need to change in current physics to show how the processes of metamorphosis can be controlled in that amazing way that goes on inside the decomposition of an insect inside and the reconstitution of the new forms. Maybe someone will come up with something, but I can't offer you a suggestion as to what it might be. And if I could, I would be that great new genius, but I'm not.
How do you think some people like Professor Josh Bongard, Michael Levin, their work has it been adding to your ideas in any way or changing them?
I think by and large, they produce examples where I find there's something missing. And so that gives me a new kind of application or a new challenge to say, what exactly have they not got right? What is missing in what they're saying? And what form could the answer take? And I may not be able to answer that, but by posing the challenge, I'm hoping I might be able to provoke cleverer, younger brains to come up with ideas, and I may be able to understand or may not, but maybe through that kind of interaction with the community, through things like what you're just organizing, may come entirely new ideas, and that in 10, 20 or 100 years from now, we'll be able to trace them back to some of these things, but they will be very different from anything we can imagine. Well, in details, some of the details may be very different from anything we can imagine now.
One of the concepts you talk about, and I think you might have mentioned it briefly, was information without bits. I mean, part of the critical idea behind your work. Could you give us an example of what this might look like? How would information without bits exist and operate in systems without any symbolic encoding?
Without bits? Well, I don't think that the earliest organisms, these single-celled things, had bits in anything like what we have in our electronic systems. But they did have molecular structures of various sorts. And those molecular structures were based on aspects of fundamental physics, about which I perhaps don't know enough. But it may be that fundamental physics needs to be enlarged, and nobody yet knows exactly what it is that it may enable those fundamental particles in the very earliest organisms to act as they do. But whatever it was, it's clear that in the very earliest organisms, there were kinds of interactions going on that enabled things to come together, to work together, to do things together, and to interact with their environments in a cooperative way, which enabled them to form new structures and to do things that they couldn't previously do. So if someone can go back and say something new about the prehistory of science, the very earliest forms of not life, but precursors of life, or proto-life, or whatever you want to call it, on the planet, that might come up with entirely new ideas that nobody else, and certainly not I, have so far been able to articulate. But I can't at this stage say what that would look like. If I could, I might get a prize of some sort for that.
You and Jackie Chappell propose a theory of meta-configured genomes, which is a framework for understanding and how development and learning are intertwined. Could you walk us through what this theory is, and how it advances our understanding of both evolution and intelligence?
How does a meta-configured genome do that?
Or can it do that?
Well, yeah. Well, meta-configured means that it has abilities that depend on something more than just what's there in the genome as normally understood. And what that something more is basically what I'm saying we need to find out. And I'm not yet able to say what it is, but it will involve abilities to interact in complex ways, in ways that allow things to combine to achieve things that they could not achieve on their own, using mechanisms that have yet perhaps to be discovered. And maybe next year you'll have an idea what that might be, and you can thank me for prodding you into it. But I don't know, maybe someone else will, who knows.
Well, that brings me to sort of the topic of cognition before language. When you talk about cognition arising, well, the ability to share information and use it long before language as part of an evolutionary process, how does that then affect the way we perceive other mammals, animals in general? and the way we consider them in terms of do we attribute consciousness to this being, cognition, intelligence? How do we define and differentiate between these when looking at ourselves and maybe other animals as well?
Well, it's clear that there are very many intelligent animals, but with different sorts of intelligence. And so the intelligence of a horse is very different from the intelligence of a chimpanzee. Horses cannot climb through trees. On the other hand, when a new horse is born, that horse can very quickly get up and stand and go and suck its mother. And this is really quite important because animals like horses and deer and so on may be chased by predators, and the young need to be able to run, and the mothers cannot pick them up and carry them the way that in many other species the parents can pick up and carry the young. A horse cannot carry a baby horse. So from a very early stage, the horse, even just after birth, has to be able to get up and go and suck. And that is part of an amazing process of biological evolution that I don't expect anybody currently understands in detail, but it makes possible this ability of the horses the newborn horses to run with the herd. But they still may need to be protected. I mean, when a collection of deer or whatever is being chased by other animals, they may stand around their young and help to protect them. I think elephants can do some of that as well, but they can't pick them up and carry them and so on. So they have to be able to help them in that way. But I don't think I'm saying yet anything very specific. I'm just saying there's a lot of research to be done to work out the details of how all of that works. And maybe that will change some aspects of current biology in ways that nobody can currently understand or anticipate, or maybe it'll just be small changes that will not make a huge difference. I suspect there may be some deep changes required, but I can't say what they are.
When you look at intelligent systems, at what point do you start to sort of differentiate? Not to say that you do consider this a binary distinction, but at what point do you look at an intelligent system and think, okay, this system is possibly conscious or has some sort of a what is it like to be experience versus something that doesn't?
I don't like the phrase what it is like to be. I don't remember where that came from.
Thomas Nagel.
Yes, a long time ago. Well, is it like anything to be an earthworm? I don't know what that means. But the thing that we can ask is what kinds of information can such a thing, an earthworm or whatever, acquire and use, and how does it use it, and what does it use it for? So what's the information? How is it acquired? How is it transformed? And what is all that used for? What does it achieve? And that will differ enormously across different species. And so there's no simple answer. There'll be lots of a wide variety of species-specific answers. And there may be some patterns which we can find if we start studying them and saying there's a group of organisms that share this kind of way of acquiring and using information, and there are others that don't do that. They do something very different, and as a result, their life forms can be different. They can live in different environments, for example, living in trees as opposed to living in the ground and so on. So there's a huge amount of filling in of gaps in our current knowledge that might come from further work of the sort that I'm trying to do, but I think I've only started. and I'm hoping other cleverer younger people will be able to extend long after I'm not able to.
Well, you mentioned trees, and a part of your work you highlight the astonishing feats that birds or insects, I mean, the things they can do navigating dense forests, flying through moving branches, and doing all these amazing things with these tiny little brains. What do you think we're missing in terms of neuroscience or even AI? For example, can machines ever match biological complexity? Do you think that we'll ever reach a point where a machine can do something similar to a metamorphizing, is that even a word, a metamorphosizing insect?
Well, if by a machine you mean something made in a factory out of plastic and wire and metal and so on, I doubt that we'll be able to do something of that sort that can do most of the things that animals can do. They may do small subsets, but it's one thing to be able to make such things, and another thing to be able to explain how the existing ones work. And I'm perhaps more focused on trying to explain how the existing things work rather than claiming we could make new ones like that. Although it may be possible in future laboratories of a sort that I can't right now imagine, that they will be able to somehow or other start assembling from collections of chemicals of some sort or whatever, assembling organisms. I suspect not. I think they'll always have to start from what nature has produced and perhaps combine those in new ways to produce new things. But I don't know. I mean, you can never know what future scientists will think up. There was something there that I think I was supposed to go on to and I didn't follow up. Is there a gap you're aware of in what I was saying? Well, the thing about trees came when I just happened to be looking out of the window and noticing some butterflies or other things that they seem to be moving through the trees while the trees were swaying a lot. And I wondered, are they able to keep out of the way of these moving things, or do they just get pushed around and it doesn't matter because they're soft enough and they don't get damaged and they survive? And I couldn't really tell. So I was left with an open question there about whether they have clever ways of using some sort of insect intelligence to react to all this motion in order to protect themselves, or whether they are just built in such a way that they don't get damaged because they are soft and flexible and so on, and they don't need to use any special kind of intelligence. There may be people who already know the answer to that, but at the moment, for me, it's just a question. I don't know if anybody else has ever asked that question, actually.
But when you think about them flying through these trees and doing what they're doing, a part of me was thinking about you speak about how organisms can store and manipulate information externally. Does this sort of align with the 4E cogSci idea of extended or embodied cognition? Do you feel like this informational perspective can be called some sort of an extended or embodied information?
Well, it's very clear that for many organisms, they do create information outside of themselves, um, either for use by other members of the same species, by using signals of various kinds and so on, or by uh, sharing in some ways with other species that they interact with. I've given the example I gave previously was flowers and insects. In the they not only the insects not only get the nectar from the flowers, they also get some information from them, because the flowers have developed ways of attracting the insects. So in some sense, the flowers are saying, are providing information saying, come to this place if you're an insect, a flying insect of the sort, and then you'll be able to get your juice or whatever you're looking for, nectar. And they don't say, and therefore you'll also get some of my pollen. That's a side effect. The insect isn't particularly interested in getting pollen or doing anything with it, but the flower needs it, the insect, to collect the pollen and transfer it when it goes to the next flower and so on. So I think I'm answering your question, but with a bit of hand waving going on.
While reading a lot of your work, a question that came onto my mind was, are you trying to move toward a unified theory of life and mind? Is this sort of an overarching goal that you have right now, is to build a sort of unified theory that integrates biology, information theory, AI, and physics, almost like a theory of everything? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it would be nice to be able to claim that I'm at least contributing to that. I don't know whether I have a right to say that, but if I suspect that if there ever is such a complete theory, a lot of the things that I've been talking to you about and been writing about, so will be important fragments of such a theory, but they might have to be revised and improved and extended in order to play a full role in the whatever final theory, if there ever is a final theory, it comes out. And that would be it would be nice to think that one could contribute to something like that. But at the moment, I just don't know. And you may have a view about it, perhaps, but we can wait and see. Yes.
I'll put a link to your What is Life and all the papers that you've written. I'll try and put as much as possible. But as you write this, when someone else clicks the link, has a look at it, has a read, what would you like them to take away most from the work you've done so far?
Well, I'm hoping that some of them will discover gaps that I haven't noticed, and then ask questions that I haven't asked about how to fill the gaps. Also, some of them may see the question that I've asked and see that the answers I have tentatively proposed are not deep enough, or have gaps, or have flaws of some sort, and they may then be able to come up with suggestions for improving the answers. So I see this as a possible collaborative, perhaps long-term process over time. And what I hope is that our educational systems and political systems and other systems do not interfere too much with the ability of humans to collaborate in that sort of way, in extending human knowledge for good, interesting, worthwhile purposes, as opposed to what are all the many other nasty purposes that human knowledge is being used for at the moment.
I think it's pretty admirable when you ask someone, I mean, what they take away from your work, and their main answer is just to point out your flaws. It's a good way to be a scientist. It's a great answer. I just thought I'd mention it. When you think about the missteps, because I'm talking about you being a great scientist, and that's a great way to think. There's obviously missteps in science, and
sorry, I missed that. There's obviously what?
Sorry, Aaron. There's obviously in science there are missteps and so moving backwards, let's say.
Oh, mistakes. Yeah, right. Yeah.
And when you think about our current assumptions, when you've once said to be careful of what people claim is obviously true, I think that's something that we should always be careful and look out for? Because if someone claims something that's obviously true, we should always be skeptical. What do you believe are some of those assumptions within AI, biology, or cognitive science where it is just a fundamental truth that people work on, their dissertations, their PhDs, etc., but is an error in thinking that needs revising urgently?
Well, the one that I have really heavily emphasized in some of the stuff we've been talking about is what seems to be an obvious truth to many people, namely that neurons do most of the reasoning and the synapses just help the neurons to communicate and collaborate. And I'm saying it's the other way around. And they've got it completely wrong, or almost completely wrong in some way. There are probably others that if I sat and thought for a while, I could come up with, but um, I think at the moment, there may be no people who are asking questions of a sort that might relate to the things that we've been talking about and the things that relate to what's going on in these complex biophysical and biochemical systems and what might be happening in other parts of the universe and how that might differ and how that difference might relate to some of what we've been talking about. And I have no idea. I can't, I'm just waving my hands. I can't say this is how things might be different in another part of the universe from what I've now been talking about. Instead of the biochemical constituents of organisms and so on that we now have, there might be something different going on in other parts of the universe. I have no idea if that makes any sense at all or whether it might come out. But perhaps one day someone might be able to provide an answer to that somehow, either by doing thought experiments or by collecting evidence about things that get sent out to other parts of the universe and send back messages, and somehow these messages might include clues, that sort of things happening of a type that nobody has ever thought of in this part of the universe. But I don't know.
Yeah, it reminds me of Carl Sagan and when they sent out Voyager into space with our golden record just to try and carry out some information if ever a species could spot it and interpret what we wrote. But it begs the question, I mean, are we going to be speaking the same language? How how important is that going to be when it comes to encountering something like that?
Yes, how do you start communicating with something with a language that's so different, very different from anything you've ever met before? And there may be techniques that I haven't thought of, or that some people have thought of, that, but uh, there may already be things around us that we don't notice, we're not aware of, that are using forms of language that we don't understand,
Mm.
and we can't communicate with them. Although I don't have see any specific reason to believe that, but it seems theoretically possible in some way. But right now, all I can say is here's a collection of ideas. Here are ways I can suggest for extending those ideas by doing new thought experiments, by trying out new combinations of the ideas and so on. And perhaps if enough people do that in flexible and cooperative ways and challenge one another and talk to one another, maybe some entirely new things will come out as a result. And maybe you will be a part of the process that makes that happen.
Well, hopefully we'll see. We can see what happens.
Yeah.
Aaron, what would you call this? This informational process, this idea of the synapses controlling all the information rather than the neurons themselves. What would you call this in terms of a theory or a proposal? When you introduce this idea to people, how do you define it?
Well, I don't think I've given it a name, a label, if that's what you mean. Maybe tomorrow or next week I might think of a label. But um, the phrases I've been using are the closest I can get to that. Phrases like um, the forms of communication that I've been talking about that involve collaboration across different kinds of mechanisms. But I'm just bumbling away without really coming up with an answer to your question, I think.
No, I will look. Hopefully, but at some point you
Yeah.
will come up with a nice, catchy name. It always has to have some sort of a catchy name, and then people sort of uh, get a grip of it a bit more. But something I've
Perhaps if I have a nightmare tonight, I'll come up with a name and I'll email it to you.
you just send me that email, and I'll try and make it the thumbnail of the video, guys. When you think about the mind body problem as a philosopher, as a scientist, how do you conceptualize this problem? Do you think it is a problem? Do you think there is a mind body problem? And don't worry, I know the podcast is called Mind Body Solution. I will not take offense, even if you think there is no problem. But what are your thoughts on this concept of the mind body problem?
Well, it's clear that animals have bodies of various sorts. It's clear that at least some animals have minds. But if having a mind is having the ability to acquire, use, transform, and process information, then maybe in some sense all animals have minds of a sort insofar as they do those things. And so there will be not one problem, but many problems of about explaining how those different sorts of minds work, explaining what the different sorts of information are that they have access to, explaining the different ways they can be used, explaining the different ways in which they can collaborate and compete, explaining the different ways in which they can evolve into new forms, which do new things in different ways and so on. And these are all, there's a kind of recursive structure there that I can't express very simply, but it's somehow interacting, generating, and producing more, which will interact and generate more and more stuff. And I don't know how much longer that will continue, but I suspect it can continue for a great deal, much more than it has been happening so far. And exactly what it'll look like, I obviously can't predict. But I expect some of the things I've been talking about will appear as important fragments of what comes out. But exactly what else is there as well, I can't say.
Mm. Uh, Earlier, you mentioned how much in order to remember things, you're extending your cognition by using these tools to assist you. How do you see this as an augmentation to the human race in the future? When the more augmented we become with our technological environment as an extension of our minds, do you think AI will play a fundamental role in that? How do you foresee the future of AI and its impact it'll have on humankind? And just speculative.
Well, I think I've more or less said everything I have to say about that. I'm sure AI will go on being extended. I'm sure there will be lots of forms of shallow AI which are used in perhaps in factories in controlling production plants or whatever. Um, Lots of use of stuff by Shannon, for example, uh, and other things as well. Maybe more use of biochemical mechanisms in various kinds of production. I'm sure there's a lot already going on that I only know vaguely about, and maybe if I sat down and thought a bit, I could come up with some examples. Um, but I see this all as an ongoing process. It's by no means seems to me to have come to its end. I don't have the impression that everything has been done that can be done by humans
Mm.
or humans and their tools and so on. I think of it as something that will continue to expand and diversify. And I'm sure that will continue for many years.
When it comes to telos or teleology, do you sort of see something like that occurring where it goes beyond us? This has nothing to do with us, and we're just like a stepping stone that's going to take this, I don't know, this experience forward into some sort of a different realm.
By that, I think you're hinting at the idea of something else having purposes, and the things we do help to serve the purposes of that something else.
Hmm.
At the moment, I have no reason to believe there is any such thing that could have such purposes, that could use us in the way that we're being used at the moment. I don't say that I can prove there isn't any such thing or that there cannot be any such thing, just that right now I have no reason to believe there is such a thing. But if there is, it's helping to make a mess of the world at the same time as generating a lot of amazing new technology, which is being used in all sorts of different ways, including enabling things like this interaction to happen and so
Hmm.
on.
Yeah, it's like it's sort of a give and take. Eh? So if we do see that way, if we do see it that way, we're obviously going to have to take the bad with it, and sort of justify why this has happened along the way. Yeah, it could be very unnecessary. But I guess with that being said, Aaron, when you look back at all the work you've done, the work you're currently doing, what what do you think people should know about your work that we might have not touched on in this conversation so far? Because there's so much to cover, and I tried to focus this on a specific on the paper you sent me, but there's so much you did send me prior to that I wish we could touch on. But it's obviously so much work over so many years that we can touch on different podcasts. But if we're to towards the last end of this conversation, at what part of your work would you think is most important to highlight and bring up now?
Well, as you say, there is a lot. I think I would like to know that in the near future, some really clever people will be looking at the stuff I've most recently been thinking and writing about uh, in connection with the forms of transformation that can go on, and the way in which the forms of transformation can be themselves transformed and so on, and some of the limitations of what's going on in there, and also whether that challenges current fundamental theories in physics. So I'm hoping that perhaps somebody will come up with answers to those questions. We'll be able to say, yes, this bit of current quantum physics is wrong. We didn't realize that this bit needs to be changed or something. I can't give any example because I don't know enough about current quantum mechanics. But there are a few people who have been claiming that current quantum physics is mistaken and needs to be uh, altered in some way. Anthony Leggett, whom I mentioned, the old friend, is one of them. And there's another one who um, is often in the news. I've temporarily forgotten his name. Um, you may be able to remember whom I'm thinking of. He has this view that the universe has perhaps a succession of cycles, and there's successions of big bangs, and each time the universe evolves in some way and goes through a whole lot of things, and then it, you know who I'm thinking of.
I think I do. I'm just trying to get his name into my head.
Yeah, well, we can maybe later look up the name and we'll come share it online, and you can add it
Yeah.
somewhere somehow to.
Try and put a link there. Yeah.
Yeah, but he and he's been doing this for quite a long time. But at the moment, my impression is that there's quite a lot of hand waving there without enough substance.
Mm.
Um, and he has a collaborator who's a neuroscientist who talks about stuff going on in particular bits of the nervous system, but I'm not convinced that they can do what he thinks they can do. Um, and So it's possible that some of that work will be improved on in some ways as a result of some of the things that you and I are talking about, and
Mm.
Tony Leggett perhaps and others. But at this stage, I can't say how.
Do you feel that certain fields, well, let's take quantum mechanics, for example. Do you think that theories that are trying to incorporate quantum mechanics into trying to understand is something like information, they sort of reduce it to something they just don't understand, and you find it a little bit annoying that people try and explain everything using quantum mechanics because we really just don't understand it?
Well, quantum mechanics is obviously very important, and there are various aspects of it.
Hmm.
Um, there's a book called What is Life, written by a famous physicist. I've temporarily forgotten his name now.
Erwin Schrödinger.
That's right, thank you. Um, and he talks about aspects of biology that he thinks might require extensions to fundamental physics, um, including the use of catalysts in processes of reproduction and so on. And then he later modified and extended his ideas and so on. Um, now, I was inspired by his work, but that took me in different directions because I ended up postulating that there were things that he hadn't asked and hadn't answered, and the things that I was talking about addressed some of those things that he hadn't. But I wondered what he would say if I told him about these, and I don't know really.
Hmm.
Um, he might say, "Oh yes, now that adds, but you have left out something, and this bit of stuff that you don't know about in physics will be relevant to that part of your problem that's not yet answered." I don't know. There might be more interdisciplinary collaboration that would help to extend what I've been doing in important ways that I could not possibly do on my own. Um, and maybe nobody on the planet at the moment can do, but some bright person reading all the stuff and thinking about the other people will come up with ideas, and then come up with a way of extending things that makes a big difference to the answer to the questions.
Well, I think it's pretty cool. It's almost beautiful when you think about it. I mean, Erwin Schrödinger, when he writes "What is life," you look at this and try and answer it, and then think of so many new questions to ask and answers to some of the questions, and then you're also writing about what is life at this point in your life, and asking for the same thing from the next generation moving forward. There's always going to be someone who's going to add to that, ask what is life, answer your question, ask a few more questions. And that might, I'm not saying there is a telos, but that could be a weird way of having some sort of a purpose within informational systems, is trying to consistently generate answers to these fundamental questions. And I think it's pretty cool. And even though I'm not calling it a teleological thing, but it's just a beautiful process that's happening at the moment.
And if it can go on forever, getting more complex, that would be nice. But it may be that there reaches a point where there's nothing more to add because you go around in circles. If you add anything, you'll find someone somewhere has already thought of that, and this is what it does, but it doesn't do enough. Yeah.
Aaron, it's been an incredible conversation. I mean, only today, for some reason, I realized that you studied in South Africa, which is pretty crazy. Do you ever miss it back down here? Not really.
So do I ever look what? Sorry.
I said only today did I realize that you actually studied in South Africa. Um,
Oh, at Cape Town University.
yeah,
Yes, that's where I had my first degree. And some of this all started because I was an atheist, and I used to go to meetings of the Student Christian Society. And I thought that the people who were telling these students things that they believed, I thought were making unjustified claims. And I started asking questions and challenging them and saying, "How can you know that?" sort of thing. And one of the other students who was there, who was also Christian, but he's very intelligent. He said, "You're asking these questions, but you might be able to formulate better questions if you read this book." And he lent me Bertrand Russell's book, The History of Western Philosophy. So I took that away and started reading it. And the more I read, the more I began to believe Bertrand Russell is the greatest philosopher who ever lived. And that went on for a while until I started having new thoughts and thinking, no, Russell hasn't answered this question, he hasn't answered that question. And that triggered new thoughts and so on. So there's been a lot of books and people and things inspiring me, and then triggering new things that challenge the things that had previously inspired me, which then challenged me to do yet more things that led me to challenge more things that challenged me. And so there's been a lot of feedback in the system, making it more and more complex as time went on. And I suspect that across collections of minds, that process could continue.
I think it's wonderful in the sense that many people, when you ask them when is the last time you changed your mind, they tend to not really know. But in your case, you've actively done this for so many years. It's a mark of a great scientist and a true philosopher in that you're able to change your view, change your perspective, adapt, and move forward without taking it personally.
Yeah, well, thinking about metamorphosis in insects happened only a few weeks ago for the first time in the precise way that I did it. And that caused me to realize that there's something going on there that I had never asked about, and I didn't know anybody else had ever asked about. And I haven't found anybody who's that I've, in what I've been looking at, that can explain how the process of metamorphosis decomposes the structures that are already there and then reorganizes them to form these entirely new structures. But maybe there is something that I don't know about. So far, I haven't found it.
Well, if anyone's watching or listening finds anything, and send us the links, send me the links, and I'll definitely forward it to you, Aaron. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been such a pleasure. It's been a privilege. Any final words from your side, Aaron? Anything you want to say before we close off?
Well, only to thank you, because it's very nice for me to know that someone is taking these ideas and helping me to communicate them using the technology that you've got that I can't operate and so on. And maybe that will help to extend the ideas through other people taking it on and following it up. And perhaps they will do it through you by saying, can we have a meeting? Because I'd like to talk to you about some of the things that you did there, and you could take them further. And maybe you invite me along later to comment.
Yeah, that's exactly the purpose of this channel, and that's why I started it. Was primarily to initially was because it was a great opportunity to pick the brains of some of my favorite scientists, but then also to realize that it would be a great way to get their work out there to maybe people who either would never have appreciated it or now finally get to hear more about it in a different way. And this is precisely the purpose. And I hope someone watching this comes up with some sort of a brilliant idea and they can share it with me. And if I can share it with you and have you back on the show and discuss it, it would be exactly what this podcast is for.
Right. I don't know how much longer I'll be able to function, but while I can, I'm willing to try.
Try my best to try and make it happen as soon as we can.
Okay.
Thanks once again. Really appreciate your time.
And thank you.